Hey, this is Brett, and you're watching Brett and Some Books. We are starting Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72 by Hunter S Thompson. Great, best selling author of The Great Shark Hunt. I don't remember that one. Author's note. Dawn is coming up in San Francisco now, 6:09 a.m. I can hear the rumble of early morning buses under my window at the Seal Rock Inn. Out here at the far end of Geary Street, this is the end of the line. For buses and everything else, the western edge of America. From my desk, I can see the dark, jagged hump of Seal Rock looming out of the ocean in the gray morning light. About 200 seals have been barking out there for most of the night. Staying in this place with the windows open is like living next to a dog pound. Last night, we had a huge paranoid poodle up here in the room, and the dumb bastard went totally out of control when the seal started barking, racing around the room like a chicken hearing a pack of wolves outside the window, howling and whining, leaping up on the bed and scattering my book galley pages all over the floor, knocking the phone off the hook, upsetting the gin bottles, trashing my carefully organized stacks of campaign photographs. Off to the right of this typewriter, on the floor between the beds, I can see an 8x10 print of Frankie Mankiewicz yelling into the phone at the Democratic Convention in Miami. But that one will never be used because the goddamn hound put 5 big claw holes in the middle of Frank's chest. That dog will not enter this room again. He came in with the book editor, who went away about 6 hours ago with 13 finished chapters, the bloody product of 55 consecutive hours of sleepless, foodless, high-speed editing. But there was no other way to get the thing done. I'm not an easy person to work with in terms of deadlines. When I arrived in San Francisco to put this book together, they had a work hole set up for me downtown at the Rolling Stone office. But I have a powerful aversion to working in offices, and when I didn't show up for 3 or 4 days, they decided to do the only logical thing, move the office out here to the Seal Rock Inn. One afternoon, about 3 days ago, they showed up at my door with no warning and loaded about 40 pounds of supplies into the room. 2 cases of Mexican beer, 4 quarts of gin, a dozen grapefruits, and enough speed to alter the outcome of 6 Super Bowls. There was also a big Selectric typewriter, 2 reams of paper, face cord of oak firewood, and 3 tape recorders, in case the situation got so desperate that I might finally have to resort to verbal composition. We came to this point sometime around 33rd hour, when I developed an insoluble writer's block and began dictating big chunks of the book straight into the microphone, pacing around the room at the end of an 18-foot cord and saying anything that came to my head. When we reached the end of the tape, the editor would jerk it out of the machine and drop it into a satchel, and every 12 hours or so, a messenger would stop by to pick up the tape satchel and take it downtown to the office, where an unknown person transcribed it into a manuscript paper and sent it right to the printer in Reno. There's a comfortable kind of consistency in this kind of finish, because that's the way of all the rest of the books was written. From December 71 to January 73, in airport bars, all-night coffee shops, and dreary hotel rooms all over the country, there's hardly a paragraph in this jangled saga that wasn't produced in last-minute, teeth-grinding frenzy. There was never enough time. Every deadline was a crisis. All around me were experienced professional journalists, meeting deadlines far more frequent than mine, but I was never able to learn from their example. Reporters like Bill Grider from the Washington Post and Jim Naughton of the New York Times, for instance, had to file long, detailed, and relatively complex stories every day, while my own deadline fell every 2 weeks, but neither one of them ever seemed in a hurry about getting their work done, and from time to time they would try to console me about the terrible pressure I always seemed to be laboring under. Any $100-an-hour psychiatrist could probably explain the problem to me in 13 or 14 sessions, but I don't have time for that. No doubt it has something to do with a deep unseated personality defect, or maybe a kink in whatever blood vessel leads to the pineal gland. On the other hand, it might easily be something as simple and basically perverse as whatever instinct it is that causes the jackrabbit to wait until the last possible second to dart across the road in front of a speeding car. People who claim to know jackrabbits will tell you they are primarily motivated by fear, stupidity, and craziness. But I've spent enough time in jackrabbit country to know that most of them lead pretty dull lives. They are bored with their daily routines. Eat, fuck, sleep, hop around the bush now and then. No wonder some of them drift over the line into cheap thrills once in a while. There has to be a powerful adrenaline rush and crouching by the side of the road, waiting for the next set of headlights to come along, then streaking out of the bushes with split-second timing and making it across the other side, just inches in front of the speeding front wheels. Why not? Anything that gets the adrenaline moving like a 440-volt blast in a copper bathtub is good enough for the reflexes and keeps the veins free of cholesterol. But too many adrenaline rushes in any given time span has the same bad effect on the nervous system as too many electroshock treatments are said to have on the brain. After a while, you just start burning out the circuits. When a jackrabbit gets addicted to road running, it is only a matter of time before he gets smashed. And when a journalist turns into a politics junkie, he will sooner or later start raving and babbling in print about things that only a person who has been there can possibly understand. Some of the scenes in this book will not make much sense to anybody except the people who were involved in them. Politics has its own language, which is often so complex that it borders on being a code, and the main trick in political journalism is learning how to translate, to make sense of the partisan bullshit that even your friends will lay on you, without crippling your access to the kind of information that allows you to keep functioning. Covering a presidential campaign is not a hell of a lot different from getting a long-term assignment to cover a newly elected district attorney who made a campaign promise to crack down on organized crime. In both cases, you find unexpected friends on both sides, and in order to protect them and keep them as sources of private information, you wind up knowing a lot of things you can't print and or which you can only say without even hinting at where they came from. This was one of the traditional barriers. I tried to ignore it when I moved to Washington and began covering the '72 presidential election. As far as I was concerned, there was no such thing as off the record. The most consistent and ultimately damaging failure of political journalism in America has roots in the clubby, cocktail personal relationships that inevitably develop between politicians and journalists, in Washington or anywhere else where they meet on a day-to-day basis. When professional antagonists become after-hours drinking buddies, they are not likely to turn each other in, especially not for, quote, minor infractions, end quote, of rules that are neither side takes seriously, and on the rare occasion when minor infractions suddenly become major, there is panic on both ends. A classic example of this syndrome was the disastrous Eagleton affair. Half of the political journalists in St. Louis and at least a dozen in Washington press corps knew Eagleton was a serious boozer with a history of mental breakdowns, but none of them had ever written about it, and the few who were known to have mentioned it privately clammed up 1,000% when McGovern's harried staffers began making inquiries on that fateful Thursday afternoon in Miami. Any Washington political reporter who blows a senator's chance for the vice presidency might as well start looking for another beat to cover, because his name will be instant mud on Capitol Hill. When I went to Washington, I was determined to avoid this kind of trap. Unlike most other correspondents, I could afford to burn all my bridges behind me, because I was only there for a year, and the last thing I cared about was establishing long-term connections on Capitol Hill. I went there for two reasons. One, to learn as much as possible about the mechanics and realities of a presidential campaign, and two, to write about it the same way I'd write about anything else, as close to the bone as I could get, and to hell with the consequences. It was a fine idea, and on balance, I think it worked out pretty well. But in retrospect, I see two serious problems in that kind of merciless, ball-busting approach. The most obvious and least serious of these was the fact that even the few people I considered my friends in Washington treated me like a walking bomb. Some were reluctant to even drink with me, for fear that their tongues might get loose and utter words that would almost certainly turn up on the newsstands 2 weeks later. The other, more complex problem had to do with my natural out-front bias in favor of the McGovern candidacy, which was not a problem at first, when George was such a hopeless underdog that his staffers saw no harm in talking frankly with any journalist who seemed friendly and interested. But when he miraculously emerged as the front-runner, I found myself in a very uncomfortable position. Some of the friends I'd made earlier, during the months when the idea of McGovern winning the Democratic nomination seemed almost as weird as the appearance of a full-time Rolling Stone correspondent on the campaign trail, were no longer just a handful of hopeless idealists I'd been hanging around with for entirely personal reasons, but key people in a fast-rising movement that seemed capable in not only winning the party nomination, but driving Nixon out of the White House. McGovern's success in the primaries had a lasting effect on my relationship with the people who were running his campaign, especially those who had come to know me well enough to sense that my contempt for the time-honored double standard in political journalism might not be entirely comparable with the increasingly pragmatic style of politics that George was getting into, and their apprehension increased measurably as it became obvious that dope fiends, anarchists, and big beat Rolling Stone and big beat dropouts were not the only people who read the political coverage in Rolling Stone. Not long after McGovern's breakthrough victory in the Wisconsin primary, our establishment mouthpiece Stuart Alsop went out of his way to quote some of my more venomous comments on Muskie and Humphrey in his Newsweek column, thus raising me to the level of at least neo-respectability at about the time McGovern began to look like a winner. Things were never the same after that. A cloud of hellish intensity had come down from the McGovern campaign by the time it had rolled into California. Mandates came down from the top, warning staffers to beware of the press. The only exceptions were reporters who were known to have a decent respect for things said in confidence. And I didn't fit in with that description. And so much for all that. The point I meant to make here, before we wander off on the tangent about jackrabbits, is that everything in this book except the footnotes was written under the savage deadline pressure and the traveling vortex of a campaign so confusing and unpredictable that not even the participants claimed to know what was happening. I'd never covered a presidential campaign before I got into this one, but I quickly got so hooked on it that I began betting the outcome of each primary, and by combining aggressive ignorance with a natural instinct to mock the conventional wisdom, I managed to win all but 2 of the 50 or 60 bets I made between February and November. My first loss came in New Hampshire, where I felt guilty for taking advantage of one of McGovern's staffers who wanted to bet that George would get more than 35% of the vote, and I lost when he wound up with 37.5. But from that point on, I won steadily, until November 7th, when I made the invariably fatal mistake of betting my emotions against my instinct. The final result was embarrassing, but what the hell. I blew that one, along with a lot of other people who should have known better, and since I hadn't changed anything else in this massive first draft screeds that I wrote down during the campaign, I can't find any excuse for changing my final prediction. Any rewriting now would cheat the basic concept of the book, which, in addition to the publisher's desperate idea that it might sell enough copies to cover fantastic expense bills I ran up in the course of 12 frantic months, was to lash the whole thing together and essentially record the reality of an incredibly volatile presidential campaign while it was happening, from an eye in the eye of a hurricane, as it were, and there's no way to do that without rejecting the luxury of hindsight. So this is a more jangled campaign diary than a record or reasoned analysis of the 72 presidential campaign. Whatever I wrote in the midnight hours on rented typewriters in all those cluttered hotel rooms along the campaign trail, from the Wayfarer Inn outside Manchester to the Neal House in Columbus to the Wilshire Hyatt House in LA and Fontainebleau in Miami. It's no different now than it was back in March and May and July when I was cranking out of the typewriter one page at a time and feeding it into the plastic maw of that goddamn mojo wire to some hash-addled freak of an editor at the Rolling Stone news desk in San Francisco. What I would like to preserve here is a kind of high-speed, cinematic, real record of what the campaign was like at the time, not what the whole thing boiled down to or how it fits into history. There will be no shortage of books covering that end. The last count I got was just before Christmas in '72, when an ex-McGovern speechwriter, Sandy Berger, said at least 19 people who'd been involved in the campaign were writing books about it, so we'll eventually get the whole story, for good or ill. Meanwhile, my room at the Seal Rock Inn is filling up with people who seem on the verge of hysteria at the sight of me, still sitting here wasting time on a rambling introduction, with the final chapter still unwritten and the press scheduled to start rolling in 24 hours. But unless somebody shows up pretty soon with extremely powerful speed, there will not be any final chapter. About 4 fingers on Kinghole crank would do the trick, but I'm not optimistic. There is a definite scarcity of genuine, high-voltage crank on the market these days, and according to recent statements by the official spokesman for the Justice Department in Washington, that's solid evidence of our war against dangerous drugs progressing. Well, thank Jesus for that. I was beginning to think we were never going to put the arm on that crowd, but the people in Washington say we're finally making progress, and if anyone should know, it's them, so maybe this country's about to get back on the right track. Hunter S. Thompson, Sunday, January 28th, 1973, San Francisco, Seal Rock Inn.